So hello everybody, welcome to this remote session on the missing pieces of the sort of citizen development puzzle. Just to mention, basically, I'm coming to you from a lockdown in Edinburgh. Obviously, hopefully see you again all in person in September for the real event. Thanks to our sponsors. A little bit of information or background about me. Basically, my background was very much on the software development side when I first started in the IT business after a couple of other careers prior to that. But I kind of got a reputation as being more on the infrastructure side of things in terms of my community activities and so on. Was never really particularly accurate. It was always very much from a software development background, at least as far as when I first started. And in recent times, I've done actually very little with what you might call the sort of SharePoint related products until really this year, when my customers, my traditional customers, have hit a number of challenges around the adoption of the increased platform that's now available. So people, most of my customers are large enterprises who had previously already done, a big SharePoint migration to SharePoint Online, well, Office 365 in reality, and then, have been sort of working with that for 2 to 3 years. And of course, now with the introduction of the Power Platform, really getting to a point where it's viable in the enterprise, there's more engagement around how to implement that for the larger business. I also point out I'm a co-organizer of the European Collaboration Summit and the European Cloud Summit, two European community conferences, one of which was supposed to be in June and the other one which is in October. So as far as this session is concerned, it's very much a kind of mindset or thought presentation. I'm not going to show any demonstrations or things like that. There's been plenty of other sessions today that go into the features and functionality available from the citizen development perspective. This session is really to kind of try and underline the importance of some of the challenges that I've seen with my customers over the last 6 or 7 months, in particular with reference to the Microsoft Power Platform. So with that in mind, I'll do initially a sort of a very brief potted history of this concept of citizen development, which, like many things in the IT sphere, is a very overloaded sort of catchphrase used mostly for marketing purposes. And so to cover some of the potted history there, which is actually pretty informative to the situation that we find ourselves in with the Microsoft capabilities. And then I'll go through at a high level what I consider to be the 4 main missing pieces of the puzzle that enterprise struggle with, or are looking for solutions and guidance in this space. And hopefully that will maybe give you pause for thought about how to approach certain things, or it might be something that you note down for later on in the journey, but also sort of try and provide a little bit of high-level guidance and solutions to some of these things as well. So if we think about the term citizen development itself, you will have seen it all over the place. Here's just some screenshots of the computer press websites where, over the last couple of years in particular, the phrase has come up more and more and is used to describe a variety of different things by sort of different perspectives or different sort of agendas within the industry, whether it's talking about moving away from using software development skills or software development companies to build solutions, and moving to the concept in terms of sort of low code or no code solutions. And it really is a overloaded term, because it's quite sort of derogatory just on spec to basically use the term citizen. And then the phrase developers is not something that really matches up with the feature capabilities that the platform companies are actually trying to realize. You know, as you can see in actually two of those examples, the Tech Republic and the Forbes article, they're both referring to a report produced by Intuit, which is a software as a service vendor, or they are now. As you might imagine, companies that used to sell point solutions that were pieces of software that you could purchase and deploy on equipment inside the organization, they've all pivoted towards selling software as a service, and therefore for them, engaging what they hope will be a active end user population to build on top of their software as a service solution is critical to longevity. So they're very quick to promote this kind of idea. So in a nutshell, citizen development, as you're probably aware from the other sessions today, is really an ability for applications, for lack of a better term, to be put together relatively quickly without any need for a software developer to write code, and generally speaking, without the overhead of having to go through an IT department, either for approval or to provision some capability, those kind of things. Now, this is most commonly used by business users, or at least that's the idea, to be able to build out very small, discrete pieces of functionality that are probably, at least initially, not considered critical. A good example would be the classic thing like an expense claim form, or a holiday booking form, or some kind of scheduling application. And these have been around for forever, of course, and the debate as to how critical they are is always governed by how much they're used. So something like that might be put together very quickly initially to meet a time-sensitive business requirement, but then very soon thereafter becomes so heavily used that by effect it is actually business critical. And generally, the approach with all of the kind of citizen development platforms that have been available throughout history, as it were, are usually a combination of different capabilities combined together that build the solution. So again, instead of using a point solution for document management, there might be a SharePoint library used to store the documents, but other systems are used to manage things like metadata. So this is nothing new, as you might expect. There's been versions of this for as long as there's been IT systems. Of course, originally we had things like the Lotus Office suite, that was client applications that run on desktop computers and things like Office. One of my major headaches over the last 10 years was actually an Access database, which was being used to manage the ingredients that were used within a plant that manufactured frozen potatoes. And this was in the United States. I was out there for 6 months because this Access database had basically the secret source of how that processing plant worked. But of course, the people who put together the Access database had long since left the organization. Nobody understood any of the stuff that was in that database, or application as it ended up being. And they wanted to move away from it, but the majority of that project was not building the new system. It was basically unpicking this, incredibly complicated, grown over time application to make it, into smaller chunks in order to be able to make use of some newer technology. Here's another few examples of the old ways of doing citizen development. This is Lotus Domino Designer, which is basically a forms designer with basically the same end capability that we see today across the other platforms available to us. It's obviously very old style from a user interface perspective. but it's basically the same type of approach. And we have another example of somewhere, yeah, this again is an example of Domino being used to integrate a discrete list of tasks, so a task list, what you might think of as Microsoft To Do, and a Microsoft project plan, combining them together to provide a aggregated task view across the two different systems. And this is something that we actually see presented at multiple points on the evolution of the Power Platform as one of the target use cases. And this screenshot is from 2007, so over 10 years ago. And actually, in terms of migration, a lot of companies have still got this platform in production. And the reason they have it in production is because there's so many of these discrete business applications that are still sitting in that platform. And it's not straightforward as it should seem to move them away into a new platform. So, the reason why things like Domino are still effectively always in place in a large enterprise is these citizen developed applications. Another example, it's a bit closer to Microsoft technology, is a thing called the Digital Dashboard Starter Kit, which was the precursor to SharePoint. Don't actually have a very good example here, but it surfaced everything within a HTML view inside of the Outlook client application. But you can see, things like an organizational chart and task lists and so on in here as well. And then we kind of get a bit more up to date with what we used to have, if you think about things prior to Microsoft 365, a combination of the Office client applications where most of the data is worked on. We have a storage capability, which is effectively SharePoint. And then we have 3 other tools that allow us to combine things together to get interesting results. So we had a thing called InfoPath, we had SharePoint Workflows, and we had SharePoint Designer. And in the on-premises world, for basically the life cycle of the SharePoint product, when it was on-premises, this was the de facto approach to citizen development. We also had other capabilities, things like business connectivity services, managed metadata, and so on, which would also be helpful. But this was effectively the toolkit for the vast majority of business user built solutions on top of the SharePoint platform. And this is really where the migration pain starts for most customers. Most enterprises were, to one degree or another, already invested in SharePoint. And all of these approaches were heavily promoted by the vendor, but they did have drawbacks. And one of the many things that's been used to promote the new approaches is all of the downsides of working with things like InfoPath and SharePoint Designer in particular. And whilst it's true the new platform does address some of those downsides, most of the downsides were not really about the technology per se, but about how they were implemented and then managed over 3 or 4 years. And so that really gives us a sort of clear point going forward to have a point of reference. This is the situation that we want to try and avoid being in with the Power Platform or Microsoft 365. In other words, we've got an incredibly rich capability, but we want to be cautious that we don't end up with the same sort of mess that we had previously, which is not really a technical discipline at all. It's very much a governance and people consideration. So bring us sort of, well, not quite up to date because the branding changes frequently, but this screenshot was taken a couple of days ago from Matt Wade's website, which basically shows a periodic table of the various component parts of Microsoft 365. No doubt there'll be a few things missing here and a few things that are perhaps now out of date. But nonetheless, it gives you an example of just how much stuff there is. And this is one of the biggest problems for the citizen developer. If we have a simple business requirement where we want to have a custom task management capability, say we want to handle incoming information requests into the organization, well, which of these component parts is the right tool for the job? Of course, like most things with computers, there isn't one right answer. There's probably 6 right answers, and which of those 6 things is the best for a particular need can be very variable, and it can very much depend on the skills of the users, the skills of the people implementing it, and what other sorts of non-functional requirements might exist. And so this navigating through this is one of the key challenges. The same challenge we had previously with the SharePoint on-premises product was a plethora of different capabilities, and very often something is implemented using a tool which is perhaps not appropriate for the long haul. So with our Microsoft 365, for lack of a better term, we have a very broad and rich capability. It's a much more accessible capability. If we ignore the cost perspective, in other words, the licensing implication, the ability to get started with these things is so much greater than it ever was before. And the feature capability is much richer as well. With the previous approaches, even if we look at I've kind of deliberately ignored what came between the SharePoint on-premises and what we have today. There was an area in the middle there where Microsoft tried lots of different other things like light switch and so on, and none of them really worked. And the problem, or the reason those things didn't work, is they were very much built with a fixed set of scenarios in mind, and they worked quite well for those scenarios. But if you wanted to do something slightly different, or a new business requirement came along that wasn't envisaged when that product was designed, they weren't suitable for that. A good example in Europe is the General Data Protection Regulation, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a glorious pain, but it's also something that is of critical importance to any business. And yet that did not exist 3 years ago. So even though the processes that one needs to implement are relatively simple from a technical point of view, the idea of building tooling that is very broad and can do pretty much anything, versus the idea of building tooling that's geared towards a particular approach to a process, those two things are very different. So now Microsoft have addressed that by having a very feature-rich collection of tools. Instead of having just 4 things that are quite large and complicated, there's lots of small things that individually are very simple and straightforward to get started with. So that's fundamentally how the Power Platform and associated services, things like To-Do and so forth, address the integration challenges from a technical perspective. And from a Microsoft marketing perspective, they call that an application platform without limits, or rather I should say an app platform, because app is the new word for application. And hopefully you will have all seen some of the other sessions today, or if you haven't seen them, you can get the recording, but talk a lot about the individual capabilities within the different workloads and services. That's not the intent of this session. It's really just to say that we have now on the Microsoft platform from a set of services and capabilities that allow us to do things far quicker and easier than we ever could before. And that's wonderful, but it's not without some significant drawbacks. So it's all very well having this incredible toolbox, and it's a bit like having an actual toolbox of real tools. You can have the big cabinet in the garage with all the drawers and all of these different kind of tools, but if you don't know which one to use for particular tasks, or you're not aware that if you use the wrong tool, you might actually you might cause damage to components, then the toolbox itself is not effective. Right? So we have some gaps or some missing pieces that we don't necessarily have to address, but we need to be aware of. And this is very variable depending on the type of organization. So if you're a small to medium enterprise with a couple of thousand users and a relatively technically literate user population, some of these things are less important than if you are at a 120,000 user global corporation, because the ability to make change is going to be very different, and the requirements placed upon you are going to be very different as well. So these four are the main ones. They're not it's not by any stretch a complete list, but certainly the four key challenges that have cropped up on all of the work that I've been doing in this space, and has also been discussed quite aggressively, let's say, by the community over the last year or so. The first one is quality control, and this is one of these very kind of intangible concepts. Quality control means lots of different things to different people. If you come at this from a sort of more traditional software development perspective, or indeed somebody who's maybe used SharePoint Designer or InfoPath in the past, then quality control is really concerning about how robust is the solution? Does it work for a long time, or is it only going to be suitable for a few months? Those kind of things. But then there's also, are we using the right data model? What happens if we need to change the metadata that's appropriate to the solution? Those kind of things. And then if it's a large enterprise, quality control is going to be, around a whole plethora of different non-functional requirements. And in most cases, unfortunately, inside an enterprise, the end users or business users who are creating solutions have a expertise in a business domain, but they won't have domain knowledge of some of the additional non-functional requirements that they need to adhere to. And that's true if it's somebody creating the door access entry system, as well as it is somebody building an IT-based solution. Then we move on to governance, which is a huge sort of dirty word. I refer to it as the G word. It can open up all manner of considerations, but the primary ones, as far as the sort of enterprise deployment and usage of citizen development tools, is around regulatory compliance, security, and then usage analysis and auditing and reporting and things like that. So understanding, how people are using the solution, if they're using it in the first place, and then if they are, how they are, and so on. Then we've got training and support. This one is always overlooked. There seems to be a point in time when the IT business made a sort of choice or a determination that everybody on planet Earth is comfortable using tools like Office. And we all know that that's not the reality. There's going to be some users in an organization who are quite IT literate and are comfortable and actually, are interested in spending time understanding how esoteric features in Excel work, and then there'll be those who just don't care and struggle logging on in the morning. And so there needs to be training and support for the users of solutions as well as for the people who are building them. It's why events like this are so useful, particularly when we spend more time focusing on how to use the technology as opposed to how the technology works. Because without that, there is very little these days to actually provide support and guidance in terms of what tools to use when, what tools are good for what they're not so good at, all of those kind of things. And then lastly, I've got life cycle. And really what I mean here is the life cycle of the business solution. I'm not really talking about application lifecycle management as a software principle, but there are elements of that that are relevant as well in terms of managing the business solution. So I'll spend a little bit of time on each of these, and hopefully that will just give you a few things to think about, or a few pointers of what you can safely ignore and what you absolutely need to address as you use these tools. So quality control. First thing here to point out is, or to ask, question to ask is, can the end results that we're looking for from a business solution be achieved using a basic capability? And really the advice here is to not make things more complicated than they need to be. This is advice that I would have been trying to give to every vendor and every customer for as long as I've been doing this, and of course it doesn't always work. But if you let the software platform drive the solution implementation, it's inevitable that there will be, detrimental consequences, because we have to remember we're trying to build a business solution here. The focus should be on what do we need to get done. And if we can achieve 85% of that by keeping it simple, is that good enough? Do we really need those extra 15% or 20% that mean that we need to build something more complicated? A classic example with respect to the Power Platform here is to use things like Power Automate when actually it's not necessary. So we still have core workflows in the SharePoint product, and we still have, the core list and library capability in SharePoint Online. For a large number of things that used to be considered business application templates, you can still do it in SharePoint without having to use any other capability. That doesn't mean you can do everything like that, but for a lot of different scenarios, and I've seen this increasingly in the last few months, actually, with customers who are starting to build new things from scratch. So they're not trying to replicate something that was done the old way. They're building something new. Is a desire to sort of start building it using these newer capabilities or additional capabilities without even really sketching out what the solution needs to look like on a piece of paper first. So that's a very easy landmine to fall into, and it's quite a difficult one to get away from as well. And then in terms of guidelines and templates for these things, and this is something that's kind of slightly a criticism of the vendor, but also of the community at large, and it is improving. But if we basically just say, oh, Power Automate's wonderful, you can do everything with these the toolkits that are provided, and then if you can't with those, then you can go off and use some Azure function to do something. Well, that's not good enough for the average business user. You're basically just leaving that person to figure it all out for themselves by using the internet, using a search engine, and that's not going to lead to the type of quality that you desire. It's also going to result in the inevitable sprawl of a lot of unfinished solutions that are just sitting around. Very rarely are these things cleaned up. Now, governance is a very large topic, but I've kind of highlighted 5 things that are key from an adoption and or compliance perspective. So the user adoption is pretty important. Like most things, there's an assumption that by building a tool on top of software as a service, that the end users of the business solution will inherently know how it operates. The best example of this that I can give that's sort of an analogy is a news website. Right? You go to a news website, and immediately you're festooned with these pop-ups. You're getting one pop-up for cookies, you're going to get another one that's trying to sell you a subscription, and then as you start reading the page, something injects an advert in the top, and where you were focused on the screen has now moved down because the ad has been injected in the top of the page. Well, that type of usability problem needs to be considered in a business solution. For those who are computer literate, and that's probably most of the folks here on this session, because we've managed to dial into Teams and get connected and so on, it might seem trivial, but for a very large percentage of the true user population, they struggle with these basic things. And so we need to design the solution in a way that is easy to adopt, but we also have help along the way. So if we build the solution, we've got to invest the time to build the help that goes along with it. Then we have reporting, and this is an area where the Power Platform gives us a little bit, but not quite what we need in terms of understanding who's using the solution, how they're using it, how many workflow processes are initiated but not completed, those kind of things. So again, this is something that if we're smart about how we design the solution, we can actually add that in ourselves, but it's also something where we're pushing the vendors to improve so that we have more capability natively in the platform. Same thing for auditing. If we're working with information requests, the same example I gave earlier, it's critical that you have the ability to audit that information. So when the request was made, and again, this is an example of where, because we're building on top of Microsoft 365, we can take advantage of their compliance features, but then we need to be an expert in those features and how to hook them up. And so again, having guidance here is extremely important. Then we have access management, which is all really around identity and access control. Again, something that is increasingly important as we move more towards a world where every employee of an organization is using the tools all the time or a lot of the time. And so it becomes increasingly important that we have the ability to make sure that we know for a particular business solution that only the right group of people have access to it, and so forth. So once the usage of these kind of solutions grows over a certain point in time, at the moment, we do need to look at third-party tooling to help with some of those governance activities, particularly from a reporting perspective. There has been some other sessions today that are sort of diving deeper into some of these things. The one on what the Microsoft 365 admin needs to know here is very useful, because again, for a lot of sort of traditional Office 365 SharePoint Online folks, the Power Platform is kind of a little bit on the edge, and it's quite new for most folks. So those sessions are definitely worth referring to for more details here and more ideas of what you can put on top of your business solutions. Now, for training and support, there's a little bit of overlap with governance, of course. But one of the things that's frequently sort of missed or brushed over, if you will, is a very, very Microsoft kind of approach to things. And this really is not a criticism, it's more just a statement of reality. Microsoft is a software development company, and the vast majority of the people who build products there are, software developers. This is changing as the workforce at Microsoft is now younger, but it's still quite apparent in their approach to not just the implementation of the software, but how they deal with education, training, and customer feedback. Generally, when they release a product, initially, it's very much targeted towards technical users or their traditional kind of key stakeholder, whether it be a developer or an IT pro. And then later on, you start to get governance workbooks and, you know, tips and tricks and that kind of material. And that's usually surface for the first point. So a good example here is, and referring back to the other session that was given by Sarah first thing in the morning, is you will need administrators for the Power Platform within a deployment that is of any reasonable scale. You know, let's say you have let's say you have a dozen business solutions, so 12 business solutions or more, you're going to need somebody to administer those things. Now, could that be the same people that created them? Yes, it could be, but it's not, you know, that's not going to scale, and it's maybe not appropriate in the long haul. So that's something to consider. And if we think about just that aspect, if I go to docs.com, which is Microsoft's documentation online, the subject, Administer Power Apps, is over 1,000 pages. And then for Power Automate, which is Flow, basically is another sort of approximately 600 pages. Virtually all of the stuff in there is technical. It's saying, oh, if you want to create a custom data source, this is the blah, 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 blah that you need to know. So this is a, you know, significant role. Now, those page numbers are, compared to other products from Microsoft, actually very small. But nonetheless, these are not the type of skills that the person building the solution with the Power Platform is necessarily going to have. So it's very much an administration role. We can't expect that business users are going to be familiar with IT terms like the Common Data Service. It's just not feasible, just like it wasn't feasible that the SharePoint Designer user would understand some of the SharePoint workflow constructs in that product. So we do need additional training and support for the business user here to get the most out of, or to be able to build truly valuable business solutions using this technology. And this is not just valid towards Microsoft solutions. You know, if we look at some of the competing low-code platforms from other vendors, they have the same problem as well. And then lastly is Lifecycle. Now I've put in parentheses there, enterprise, because that's sort of my sweet spot, if you will. I do work with a small number of small organizations, but all of those customers of mine who are small organizations are actually also very highly governed themselves. In other words, they are either local authorities or military type organizations. So even though they're small, they operate like an enterprise. So the first thing is to consider whether we kind of have this open playing field where people can basically create whatever they want without any kind of life cycle consideration. And is that going to be fit for purpose? It's not to say that we need to wait until there's a life cycle management process in place before we do anything, because that would basically mean that nothing happens. But we need to kind of find a balance there, and also an ability to learn as we go through the journey. Now, there's other ISVs have broader solutions in this space. So if we look out into the marketplace, both Skyboat and Webcon are two competing low-code vendors, if you will, not really direct competition, but they're all trying to do a variation of the same thing, have much broader support for lifecycle baked into their solutions. But the reality is, it's never going to be one of 3 or 4 or 5 options. It's always going to be a bit of a combination of all of these things. So therefore, the mindset of lifecycle is more important than the implementation. So this animation basically gives an overview of what might be an ideal lifecycle. So obviously the business user has an idea for a business solution initially for the application. The most important thing is to think it through. In other words, don't start building it straight away. Sketch it out on a piece of paper or in a design tool, figure out what you want, and then sort of chop it into a couple of pieces in terms of what is effectively the data that is going to be utilized or impacted by the application, create those sources in the appropriate place, and then build the business app or the business solution, hopefully using the right tools in the toolbox. Now, then the next thing is around reviewing with IT. Well, if you don't have an IT department, this isn't really going to happen. But assuming there is an IT department, this is actually pretty important. So instead of having an app idea and then phoning IT and saying, hey, we have this requirement, can you build it for us or buy it for us? We're going to put it together and then have it reviewed by IT to make sure that it adheres to any particular data protection regulations, whether there's some kind of standard testing that needs to take place, those kind of things, before it's then published out to the wider user population. Now, of course, this is actually a pretty simple diagram, and there might be many other factors in the cycle, but the point is to have the mindset of there will be a cycle. And the most important thing on this slide is the fact that the app is going to need changed at some point. Even the simplest business solution, an expense claim form, for example, if you create that 3 years ago and it's still the same today, then it's not really getting the benefit of having this kind of platform, right? These things inevitably have to change over time. It could be something quite simple related to a business division changing within an organization, or it could be a huge, complicated change, like leaving the European Union, as an example. And so the principle that one of the primary benefits of citizen development is not just the ease and speed of creating the solution, but it's changing it as business requirements change. So that's the problem with going to a software developer and having them build a point solution for something, is that every time you want to change, you've got to phone them back up and get the change made. Whereas if we build a solution with change in mind, and we know that it's okay to throw things away if they were not fit for purpose, then we have the mindset of a life cycle that will allow us to be much more successful. What it will also do is get us away from the lock-in problem that we had with the previous approaches to this platform. In other words, the sprawl and the mess that was created by the tool dictating an approach rather than the end result. So it's perfectly okay to build quick and dirty throwaway solutions, as long as you do throw them away, okay, or recreate them. We always used to train our developers on this, and unfortunately it kind of fizzled out when the world moved to a more kind of back to a sort of client-based development model. But the idea of a proof of concept should be just that. In other words, a proof of concept shouldn't end up being production. If we look again at the traditional SharePoint migration to the cloud, one of the biggest challenges there is the discovery and assessment of these end user created applications, because they were done so long ago and the people who did them have vanished, or just basically say, I can't remember, or there's no documentation, etc. So it's perfectly okay, and that's actually one of the benefits of this platform, is that you can actually knock out very quickly things that probably work okay for one user, but when you start using them with 2,000, maybe not so good. So that's okay as a way to come up with the design sketch, if you will, as long as they are at a later point made better or thrown away and done properly, as it were. So there we go. I've kind of covered quite quickly, hopefully some thought-provoking things to consider when you're on your citizen development journey or power platform journey. And I'll just end with this slide, which is actually, from my perspective, the most important thing and where I spend the most time with customers. Particularly with the enterprise customer, there's a sort of initial phase of massive enthusiasm for the tooling, because it's very easy to look at what Microsoft are offering and say, oh well, yeah, we can do all of these things that we've been struggling with for years with that. But then once you actually start getting into the meat of it, you realize quite quickly that the challenges you had previously were not really technical challenges. And they don't necessarily go away just because the technology platform or the services available have improved. So with great power platform comes great power responsibility. If we want to avoid the pitfalls of the past, it's up to us and the platform together, not just the platform. And most importantly, citizen development, as the name should imply, but is often overlooked, is not really a technical thing at all. It's all about the people. If we go back to the sort of this diagram, we have this lady in the middle here who's the business customer, and the hipster in the suit is kind of the IT department. Well, they can't be silos, particularly in the enterprise, and they often are, but that needs to be broken down, because otherwise there'll be a block in the life cycle, and the life cycle is no good if there's something that comes along and shuts it down. And we're all experiencing that right now. You see the impact of a blocker. So with that, I'm just about I've got a few minutes left if there are any questions, but hopefully it's been useful, and I hope the SharePoint Saturday itself has been valuable, and thanks very much for paying attention.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? I would say that I love this sentence, citizen development. Technical thing, it's a people thing. Thank you, Spence, for saying this. I will share it on my LinkedIn. It's heart touching. Hopefully more people will think about it twice.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a couple of initiatives that I'm aware of, and probably some that I'm not, that are kind of trying to get more into this and sort of get it more widely out there. But yeah, we're certainly, the only places I've been successful with this with customers is if this is at the forefront or the focus. And if it's the technology focus, then it's usually, the same old story. Quite
right.
Well.
All right. So no questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Take care. And see you in September.